Gabrielle Warren noticed it before anyone said a word. Round table 6, seat 4, where her name should have been printed in gold script, held nothing but a bare white plate and an empty wine glass. She stood at the entrance of the Whitmore Grand Ballroom in her navy dress, the one she'd chosen carefully that morning, and understood immediately what had happened. Her mother had removed her. Not accidentally. Evelyn Warren did not make accidents. She made decisions, and she made them look like oversights. Gabrielle scanned the room once. Chandeliers, white orchids, 300 guests in silk and tailored suits, all gathered to celebrate her sister's engagement to the son of a shipping magnate. She found her mother near the head table, laughing with a photographer, radiant, untouchable. Evelyn's eyes met hers for exactly 1 second, long enough to confirm it wasn't a mistake, short enough to pretend it was. Gabrielle didn't ask why. She already knew. Chloe's moment. Don't complicate it. You understand, don't you, Gabby? She always understood. That was the problem. She turned, walked back through the gilded doors, past the coat check attendant who gave her a confused, apologetic look, and stepped into the cool night air of downtown Manhattan. She did not cry. She did not call anyone. She simply opened the Notes app on her phone because somewhere in the back of her mind, even now, even here, there was a client audit due Monday morning, and work had never once abandoned her at a table. Welcome back to the channel. If you love emotional billionaire romances filled with betrayal, quiet revenge, and unforgettable love stories, you're in the right place. Today's story begins with a woman whose own family erased her from the most important night of their lives. But one stranger noticed the empty chair everyone else ignored. Let's get into today's story. Inside the ballroom, 3 tables away from where the Warren family sat, Yoon Ji-hoo set down his water glass and looked toward the entrance. He'd only met the Warrens twice. Brief business circles, a shared charity board, nothing more. He was here tonight as a courtesy to Richard Warren, whose logistics company had once partnered with Ji-hoo Global Holdings on a shipping contract years ago. He hadn't planned to notice anyone, but he had noticed the woman in navy the moment she walked in. Not because of her beauty, though she was beautiful in a quiet, unclaimed way. He noticed because of how she stood. Spine straight, chin level, the posture of someone accustomed to walking into rooms that didn't want her. And then he noticed the empty seat beside her mother. And then he noticed she was gone. Ji-hoo turned to the man beside him, a mutual acquaintance from the shipping deal. The woman who just left, in navy. Gabrielle, Evelyn's older daughter. The man said it the way people say things they've stopped thinking about. Stepdaughter, actually, before the second marriage. Sharp woman. Accountant, I think. Why did she leave? The man shrugged, already reaching for another canapé. Family stuff, probably. She's not really part of tonight. Different vibe, you know? Ji-hoo said nothing. He watched the empty chair for a long moment, the untouched place setting gleaming under the chandelier light, and something in him, quiet, deliberate, the same instinct that had built an empire out of noticing what others overlooked, refused to let it go. He stood. Ji-hoo, the man said, half laughing. The toast is in 10 minutes. I'll be back. He walked through the ballroom without hurry, the way he did everything, and stepped out into the lobby. A doorman was folding a hotel map. A woman near the elevators was fixing an earring. Neither was Gabrielle. He found her instead through the tall glass windows of the hotel's side cafe, sitting alone at a small table, laptop open, a cup of coffee going cold beside her. She wasn't crying. She wasn't performing sadness for an audience that wasn't there. She was working, methodically, as if the ballroom 200 feet away didn't exist. He almost turned back. Instead, he opened the cafe door. She looked up when the bell chimed, and for half a second, something flickered across her face. Not embarrassment exactly, but the practiced neutrality of a woman who had learned to expect nothing and prepare for everything. "You're missing the toast," she said, returning to her screen. "So are you." "I wasn't invited to it." He didn't respond to that with sympathy. He sensed, correctly, that sympathy was the last thing she wanted from a stranger. Instead, he glanced at her screen. Rows of numbers, a spreadsheet dense with figures most people would find unreadable. "Forensic accounting," he said. It wasn't a question. She looked up again, more sharply this time. "How would you know that?" "The formatting, discrepancy flags, cross-reference ledgers. That's not bookkeeping. That's an investigation." For the first time that night, Gabrielle Warren looked at someone as if they'd said something worth hearing. "Most people just see numbers," she said. "Most people don't look." A silence settled between them. Not awkward, but oddly comfortable. The kind of silence two competent people share when neither feels the need to fill it. Ji-hoo gestured to the empty chair across from her. "May I sit here?" She looked at the empty chair for a moment longer than necessary, as if weighing whether solitude had served her better than company ever had. Then she nodded once. "You can sit." Ji-hoo lowered himself into the chair across from her, unhurried, the way a man sits when he has nowhere else he'd rather be. Through the glass wall behind him, the ballroom glittered on without either of them. "You didn't answer my question," she said, closing her laptop halfway. "Why did you leave the toast to find someone you don't know?" "I noticed an empty seat where a place card should have been," he said. "That doesn't happen by accident at an event like this. Someone removed it deliberately." "You're very observant for a man who's supposed to be celebrating an engagement." "I notice what doesn't fit," he said simply. "It's how I run my company." She studied him then. Really studied him, the way she studied numbers that didn't add up. Tailored charcoal suit, no watch, no rings, nothing performative. He wasn't trying to impress her. That, more than anything, was what kept her from asking him to leave. "Gabrielle Warren," she said finally, extending her hand. "Yoon Ji-hoo." She paused. The name landed with quiet weight. "Ji-hoo Global Holdings. You've heard of it. I've audited 2 of your competitors." A small, dry smile. Neither of them survived the audit particularly well. For the first time that evening, something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but close, an acknowledgement that he'd found something rare. "Then I should be careful what I say around you." "You should," she agreed. "Most people are." They talked for 11 minutes before either of them noticed the time. He asked about her work and she answered plainly, without the performative modesty women were so often trained to perform. She told him about the discrepancies she'd uncovered in a real estate trust the previous spring, the shell companies she'd traced through 4 countries, the partner at her firm who'd doubted her until the SEC hadn't. She didn't tell him about the empty chair. She didn't need to. He hadn't asked her to explain herself, and she noticed that too. Filed it away the way she filed away everything, a small data point in the growing profile of a man who didn't fit the pattern she expected from men like him. Ji-hoo, for his part, found himself doing something he rarely did in conversation, listening more than calculating his next words. Most people in his world spoke to be impressive. Gabrielle spoke to be accurate. There was a difference, and he'd forgotten how rare it was until now. "Why forensic accounting?" he asked eventually. "Most people find numbers cold." "Numbers don't lie," she said. "People do. I got tired of people." He didn't press further, but he noted the sentence, turned it over, understood there was a longer story buried beneath it, a story she wasn't ready to hand to a stranger in a hotel cafe, however observant he was. A server approached to refill her coffee, hesitated at the sight of an unfamiliar man at the table, and moved on when Gabrielle gave a small nod. "You should go back," Gabrielle said. "They'll wonder where you are." "They won't. I'm not important to tonight." "You're the head of Ji-hoo Global Holdings. You're important to every room you walk into." "Not to this one." He glanced briefly toward the ballroom's distant glow. "Tonight belongs to your sister." Something tightened in Gabrielle's jaw. Not anger, just the old, familiar ache of being reminded, gently and without malice, that this had never once been about her. "It usually does," she said quietly, and returned her attention to her screen. Ji-hoo caught it. The flicker, the practiced retreat back into competence whenever emotion threatened to surface. He recognized it because he did the same thing, had done it for years, ever since he'd learned that feeling things in front of people was a currency he couldn't afford to spend. He didn't push. He simply asked, "What are you working on?" She turned the laptop slightly toward him. Not fully, not yet, but enough. "A nonprofit audit, standard annual review." She scrolled through a column of figures. "Except 3 line items don't reconcile with the reported disbursements. Small enough that most reviewers would miss it. Large enough that over 5 years it adds up to something significant." "Which nonprofit?" She hesitated, the practiced discretion of her profession kicking in. "I can't say. Client confidentiality." "Of course." He didn't ask again, but something in his eyes sharpened, filed the moment away the same careful way she filed things. He would learn later, much later, exactly which nonprofit she meant. Tonight, he simply let it pass. Across the ballroom, Evelyn Warren was beginning her toast. "To my daughter Chloe," she said, champagne raised, voice pitched for maximum warmth, who has always been the light of this family. She scanned the crowd out of habit, checking that the right faces were watching, and noted, with a small twist of satisfaction, that Table 6's fourth seat remained empty. Clean. Uncomplicated. Exactly as she'd arranged it. She had no idea her arrangement had already failed. She had no idea that 200 feet away, in a quiet cafe with white orchids barely visible through the glass, the most powerful man in the room was sitting across from the daughter she'd tried to erase, and finding her, for the first time in either of their lives, impossible to look away from. "I should let you get back," Gabrielle said eventually, closing her laptop fully now. "You have a toast to return to." "I have a card," Ji-hoo said, reaching into his jacket and setting it on the table between them. Simple, black, embossed only with his name and a single phone number. If the audit becomes something more than a standard review, or if it doesn't. She looked at the card without touching it. "Why would you help a stranger with an audit?" "I'm not offering to help," he said. "I'm offering to listen if you ever need someone who isn't inside your family to hear it." It was such a small thing to say, and yet it was more than her mother had offered her in 31 years. Gabrielle picked up the card, turned it once between her fingers, and slid it into her bag. "Good night, Mr. Yoon." "Good night, Miss Warren." He stood, straightened his jacket, and walked back toward the glittering ballroom he had no real interest in returning to. Behind him, Gabrielle opened her laptop again, returned to the mismatched numbers on her screen, and did not look up. But for the first time that night, she wasn't entirely alone, and in a ledger 3 floors above them, buried inside the financial records of the Warren Family Foundation, a discrepancy that no one had noticed in 5 years sat waiting, patient, quiet, and about to be found by exactly the wrong person for anyone hoping to keep it hidden. The Warren Foundation Gala was 3 weeks away, and Gabrielle hadn't thought about the man with the black card since the night of the engagement party. Or so she told herself, every time she caught herself thinking about him. She was in her office on the 31st floor of Meridian Forensic Partners, blinds half drawn against the late afternoon sun, when her assistant knocked. "There's a courier here. Says it's for you specifically. Won't leave it with the front desk." Gabrielle frowned. She wasn't expecting anything. She signed for the package, a slim leather folder, unmarked except for a small embossed JGH in the corner, and waited until she was alone to open it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten, not typed, which surprised her more than the contents. "Ms. Warren, I looked into the Warren Family Foundation's public filings out of curiosity after our conversation. I'm not an accountant, but even I noticed the disbursement pattern in years 3 and 4 doesn't match the stated program expansion. I don't know if this is the nonprofit you mentioned. If it is, I thought you should see it. Before anyone else does." JH clipped to the note were 4 pages of publicly available tax filings with 3 numbers circled in blue ink. Gabrielle sat very still. She had, in fact, been circling those same 3 numbers for the past 2 weeks. Quietly. Off the clock. Because the Warren Family Foundation was not just any nonprofit client, it was her mother's foundation, the one Evelyn had built her social reputation on, the one that funded scholarships in the Warren name and put Evelyn's photograph in 3 different society pages a year. Gabrielle had told no one that she suspected the numbers didn't add up. She certainly hadn't told a Korean billionaire she'd met once over coffee for 11 minutes. He had found it on his own. She picked up her phone and typed a text to the number on the card she still hadn't deleted. "You didn't need to do this." The reply came within a minute. "I know. I did it anyway. Some patterns don't let you look away once you've seen them." She almost smiled. "Almost. Is this the foundation you were auditing?" He wrote next. She hesitated over the keyboard for a long moment before answering honestly, because something about his restraint, the fact that he'd sent the information without pushing, without demanding to be let further in, made honesty feel safe in a way it rarely did. "Yes, it's my mother's foundation." There was a pause on his end, a longer one. "Then I understand why you didn't tell me at the cafe. You're not going to ask if I'm going to pursue it?" "No," he wrote. "I trust you'll do what's right. I just didn't want you finding it alone." Gabrielle set the phone down on her desk and stared at the circled numbers for a long time after that, the low hum of the office fading around her. She had spent her entire life being the one who noticed things no one else wanted to see. The tension at dinner, the favoritism dressed up as fairness, the small cruelties disguised as jokes. She had spent her entire career turning that same instinct into a profession, because at least numbers had the decency to be honest once you found them. No one had ever handed her evidence and said simply, I didn't want you finding it alone. She didn't know what to do with that kind of quiet, so she did what she always did. She went back to work. Over the following 2 weeks, a rhythm formed between them. Not romance, not yet. Nothing either of them would have called by that name. It was something quieter. Professional respect, wearing the shape of friendship. He sent her an article about forensic accounting techniques used in a sole corruption case, asking if the methodology matched what she used. She corrected 2 of his assumptions and complimented the third. She sent him a question about how Ji-hoo Global Holdings structured its charitable foundation's audit trail, curious whether Korean corporate transparency laws differed meaningfully from American nonprofit oversight. He answered in detail, then added, "Why do you ask? Are you building a case against something?" She didn't answer that one for 2 days. When she finally did, it was simple. Maybe. They met twice more, never framed as dates, always framed as something easier to justify. Once at a financial conference where they ended up seated at the same table by coincidence and spent the panel discussion passing notes back and forth like students bored in class, except the notes were sharp, precise critiques of the speaker's flawed risk models. Once at a quiet restaurant near her office, ostensibly so he could ask her professional opinion on a due diligence report for an acquisition his company was considering. That second meeting ran 3 hours. Neither of them mentioned the time. "You never talk about your family," he observed partway through, watching her methodically pick apart the acquisition target's balance sheet with the same care she'd applied to a puzzle she genuinely enjoyed. "There's not much to say." "I don't believe that." She looked up. "Why not?" "Because every time your mother's name comes up, even indirectly, something in your face closes, like a door someone's used against you before." Gabrielle set down her pen. It was, she realized, the first time anyone outside her own head had described exactly what it felt like. The door, the closing, the years of practiced retreat. "My mother remarried when I was 9, she said finally, quietly, the words coming out plain and unadorned because she'd never learned how to dress them up. "Richard is a good man, passive, but good. Chloe was born 2 years later, and from the moment she arrived, I understood the family had a favorite, and it wasn't going to be me. That's not something a 9-year-old should have to understand." "No," she agreed. "But I did, and I got very good at making myself useful instead of loved. Grades, achievements, things that couldn't be argued with. I thought if I was excellent enough, eventually it would matter." "Did it?" She almost laughed, a small, dry sound with no real humor in it. "I graduated top of my class at Wharton. My mother didn't come to the ceremony. She had a luncheon." Ji-hoo said nothing for a moment. He didn't reach for her hand. He didn't offer the easy sympathy she would have deflected anyway. He simply sat with what she'd told him, letting it exist in the space between them without trying to fix it. And somehow that, the not fixing, was the thing that made her chest loosen slightly for the first time in longer than she could remember. "For what it's worth," he said eventually, "I don't think excellence should have to be a substitute for love. I think you deserved both." Gabrielle looked down at the balance sheet between them, at the neat rows of numbers that had never once disappointed her, and felt something unfamiliar rise in her throat. "Careful, Mr. Yoon," she said, voice steadier than she felt. "You're starting to sound like a man who cares." "I am a man who cares," he said simply. "I've just never had a reason to say it out loud before." She didn't have an answer for that, so she picked her pen back up, and they returned to the numbers, and neither of them spoke of it again that night. But something had shifted, quietly. Permanently. The way a single misplaced decimal point can change an entire ledger without announcing itself. Invisible until you know exactly where to look. The gala invitation arrived on cream cardstock embossed with gold lettering. "The Warren Family Foundation cordially invites you to its 15th annual benefit." Gabrielle had received one every year of her adult life. Every year she attended as an afterthought. A name on a table chart, rarely seated near her mother, never mentioned in the program despite having quietly balanced the foundation's books, pro bono for the past 6 years, ever since the previous accountant had retired and no one else in the family had bothered to find a replacement. This year, she wasn't attending as an afterthought. This year, she was attending as an auditor. She'd made the decision 2 nights earlier, alone in her apartment, staring at a spreadsheet she now understood completely. The discrepancies weren't clerical errors. They were patterns, small, disciplined, deliberate withdrawals disguised as administrative allocations, routed through a secondary account that didn't appear on the foundation's public filings. Over 5 years, the total came to just under $800,000. She knew, with the flat certainty of someone who had spent her career reading financial documents like other people read faces, exactly who had access to that account. Her mother. Gabrielle didn't call Ji-hoo that night. She didn't call anyone. She sat with the knowledge the way she'd learned to sit with everything uncomfortable in her life, quietly, methodically, until it stopped feeling like an open wound and started feeling like a problem she could solve. By morning, she had a plan. She requested a formal meeting with the Foundation's board 2 days before the gala, presenting herself not as Evelyn's overlooked daughter, but as Gabrielle Warren, CPA, Meridian Forensic Partners, the identity she'd built entirely without her mother's help. I'd like to propose a comprehensive independent audit of the Foundation's accounts for the past 5 fiscal years, she told the 6 board members seated around the mahogany table, her voice level, professional, betraying nothing of what the request cost her. I've identified irregularities in the disbursement records that warrant closer examination. Richard, her stepfather, sat near the end of the table, saying nothing, his eyes fixed on his folded hands. He'd been on the board for a decade. He had never once looked closely enough to notice what Gabrielle had found in a matter of weeks. Irregularities, one board member repeated carefully. Can you be more specific? I'd prefer to complete a full review before making specific allegations, Gabrielle said. I don't believe in accusing anyone based on partial information. It was, she knew, the exact opposite of how her mother operated. The board voted 4-2 in favor of the audit. Richard voted yes, the first time in Gabrielle's memory that he had taken a position that might inconvenience his wife. Evelyn wasn't in the room. She found out an hour later, and the first person she called was not the board chair, not her lawyer, but Gabrielle herself. You did this to embarrass me, Evelyn said, no greeting, no preamble, straight into accusation the way she always did when she felt cornered. I did this because the numbers don't reconcile, Mother. That's my job. Your job. You've always hidden behind that word. Job, career, as if that excuses humiliating your own family in public. No one's being humiliated yet. I haven't found anything conclusive. But you will, Evelyn said, and for just a moment, something raw slipped through the elegant composure. You always find things, Gabrielle. You've been finding things your whole life. Why can't you just let something be for once? Gabrielle closed her eyes. The old ache rose, familiar as breathing. 31 years of being told that noticing things was itself the crime. Because letting things be is how people get away with things, Mother, she said quietly. I learned that from you, actually. You taught me to notice everything. You just never expected me to notice you. The line went silent for a long moment. You'll regret this, Evelyn said finally, and hung up. Gabrielle set the phone down on her desk, hands steady despite everything, and allowed herself exactly 90 seconds to feel the full weight of what had just happened before she opened her laptop and got back to work. She texted Ji-hoo that evening, later than she usually allowed herself to reach out. I opened a formal audit on my mother's foundation today. His reply came almost instantly, as if he'd been waiting. How do you feel? Not congratulations, not concern, just the question, open enough for her to answer honestly. Terrified, relieved, both at once. That sounds about right for doing something true. She smiled at her phone, alone in her apartment, in a way she hadn't smiled in longer than she wanted to admit. Will you be at the gala? She asked. I wasn't planning to attend. Would you like me to? She considered the question longer than it warranted. I don't need rescuing. I know, he wrote back. I wasn't offering that. I was offering to be in the room if you wanted a familiar face. Nothing more. That was, she was beginning to understand, exactly how Ji-hoo operated. Never stepping in front of her, never taking the reins from her hands, only ever standing close enough that she'd know, if she needed it, that she wasn't entirely alone. Come, she wrote finally. Not to help, just to come. I'll be there. The gala took place in the same glass conservatory venue the foundation had used for a decade. The same soaring windows, the same manicured hedges lit gold beneath string lights, the same string quartet playing something restrained and forgettable. Gabrielle arrived alone, in deep emerald this time instead of navy, and found her place card waiting for her at table 3. Present. Correct. Her mother hadn't dared remove it again, not with the board watching, not with an active audit hanging over the evening like a held breath. She found Ji-hoo near the champagne fountain, speaking quietly with two board members she recognized from the meeting 2 days prior. He excused himself the moment he saw her. "You look like a woman who's about to do something difficult," he said. "I already did the difficult part. Tonight, I just have to survive being in the same room as her." "Then let's survive it together." They didn't sit at the same table. That would have invited questions neither of them was ready to answer. But throughout the evening, Gabrielle found her eyes drifting toward him across the room, and each time, he was already watching her, steady, unhurried, present. It was, she realized somewhere between the second course and the auction, the first gala in her life she hadn't spent entirely alone. Evelyn found her near the edge of the dance floor during the transition to dessert, champagne in hand, smile fixed in place for the benefit of anyone watching. "You brought him," Evelyn said quietly, nodding toward Ji-hoo without looking directly at him. "The Korean businessman. Is that what this is? You couldn't win my attention, so now you're trying to win his?" Gabrielle felt the old barb land exactly where it was aimed. Precise, practiced, decades of experience behind the throw. But something had changed in the weeks since the engagement party. She no longer needed the wound to close quickly. She could simply let it land, acknowledge it, and set it down. "I'm not trying to win anything, Mother," she said calmly. "I stopped trying to win you a long time ago. I just didn't tell you because I was still hoping you'd notice on your own." Evelyn's composure flickered, just slightly, just enough. "And him?" she asked, quieter now. "What does he see in you that I never did?" Gabrielle looked across the room, where Ji-hoo stood in quiet conversation, occasionally glancing her way without ever making it obvious. "I don't know yet," she said honestly, "but he's the first person who ever asked where I was instead of pretending I wasn't missing." She walked away before her mother could respond, and for the first time in 31 years, she didn't look back to see the reaction on Evelyn's face. She didn't need to anymore. The audit took 6 weeks. Gabrielle led it herself, alongside 2 junior associates from Meridian who knew better than to ask why their usually unflappable supervisor insisted on personally reviewing every single transaction rather than delegating the tedious work as she normally would. She didn't tell them it was because every transaction had her mother's name attached to a decision, somewhere, in some form. She didn't tell them that every late night she spent cross-referencing bank statements was also, quietly, an act of grief. The pattern, once fully mapped, was almost elegant in its simplicity. Evelyn had established a secondary discretionary account under the Foundation's Community Outreach Division 5 years earlier. The same year Chloe had graduated college and moved into a Tribeca apartment Gabrielle had always assumed was funded by Richard's business. It hadn't been. Funds had been diverted in small, defensible increments, a few thousand here for event consulting, a few thousand there for outreach materials, never large enough individually to trigger scrutiny, but compounding steadily over 60 months into $783,412. Some of it had gone to Chloe's rent, some to Evelyn's wardrobe, charged through a personal shopper who billed the Foundation as an image consultant. A smaller amount, troublingly, had gone to a private school tuition for a child who turned out to be the son of the Foundation's event coordinator. A woman Gabrielle later learned Evelyn had been protecting for reasons that took another 2 weeks to fully untangle. Reasons that led, eventually, to a decade-old affair Richard had never known about. Gabrielle documented all of it, methodically, without embellishment. The way she documented everything, she did not enjoy it. She thought more than once during those 6 weeks about simply walking away, letting the discrepancies stay buried, letting her mother keep the image she'd spent a lifetime protecting. It would have been easier. It would have been, in its own way, exactly what her family had always expected of her. Quiet compliance in service of someone else's comfort. But every time the temptation rose, she thought of the empty chair at the engagement party, the missing place card, 31 years of being asked to disappear so someone else's story could shine brighter. She was done disappearing. Richard came to her office unannounced on a Tuesday evening, 3 weeks into the audit, his tie loosened, his usual composure cracked at the edges. "Is it true?" he asked, standing in her doorway like a man who already knew the answer and was hoping against all evidence to be told otherwise. "I can't discuss specifics of an active audit, Richard." "Gabrielle, please." His voice broke slightly on her name. "I need to know if my wife has been lying to me for years." Gabrielle studied her stepfather for a long moment. He had never once defended her at a dinner table. He had never once corrected Evelyn when she introduced Chloe as my daughter and Gabrielle as Evelyn's older girl, as if the distinction needed marking. He had spent a decade choosing peace over honesty, comfort over confrontation. But he had also, 3 weeks ago, voted to allow the audit that would unravel his own marriage. That had cost him something. She recognized the cost, even if she couldn't yet forgive the silence that had preceded it. "I can tell you this much," she said finally. "When the report is finished, you're going to have questions no one in this family has been willing to ask out loud for a very long time. I'd start preparing for that now." Richard sat down heavily in the chair across from her desk, the same kind of chair Ji-hoo had once asked permission to sit in, though this time no one asked, and no permission was extended. "I should have paid closer attention," he said quietly, almost to himself. "To you, to all of it. I told myself staying quiet kept the peace." "It kept your peace," Gabrielle said, not unkindly, but not softening it either. "Mine was never part of the equation." He had no answer for that. She hadn't expected one. The final report was 312 pages long. Gabrielle presented it to the full board on a Thursday morning in October, standing at the head of the same mahogany table where she'd once been introduced in her own family's meeting as simply Chloe's sister. She walked them through the diverted funds with the same clinical precision she brought to every case. No accusation in her voice, no satisfaction, just the plain architecture of what the numbers showed. Evelyn sat at the far end of the table, spine rigid, hands folded, the elegant composure that had carried her through 30 years of social functions, finally, visibly, beginning to fracture as page after page confirmed what she had spent months insisting was impossible. "This is a mistake," Evelyn said when Gabrielle finished, though her voice had lost the certainty it once carried. "A misunderstanding. I can explain every one of these transactions." "You'll have the opportunity to," the board chair said quietly, formally, with counsel present. It was, Gabrielle noted, the first time in her life she had watched someone else tell her mother no. Evelyn's eyes found Gabrielle's across the table, pleading now, stripped of all its usual armor. "You did this to destroy me." "No," Gabrielle said, and she meant it completely. "I did this because it was true. Destroying you was never the goal, Mother. I don't need you destroyed. I just stopped being willing to protect you from the truth." She gathered her files, closed her laptop, and left the boardroom without waiting to see what came next. She had done her job. The rest belonged to people whose job it now was to decide what justice looked like. The board, the lawyers, eventually, quietly, a settlement that would keep the matter from becoming a public scandal in exchange for Evelyn's resignation from the foundation she had built her entire identity around. Gabrielle didn't stay to watch that unfold either. Chloe called her that night, voice thick with tears. Gabrielle suspected were partly grief and partly guilt. "Did you know?" Chloe asked. "About the tuition money, about Mom paying for my apartment with foundation funds. Did you know when you started the audit?" "I suspected some of it. I didn't know all of it." "Why didn't you warn me?" Gabrielle closed her eyes, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. "Because it wasn't my job to protect you from a truth you needed to know, Chloe. It was never my job to protect anyone from the truth. I just kept doing it anyway for years because I thought that's what love looked like in this family." Silence on the line. "I didn't know," Chloe said finally quietly. "About any of it. The rent. I thought Dad—" "I know you didn't know," Gabrielle said, and some of the exhaustion softened into something closer to gentleness. "You benefited without asking questions. That's not the same as guilt, but it's not innocence either. What happens now? Now you figure out who you are without Mom's version of the family standing between you and the truth," Gabrielle said. "I did that a long time ago. It's harder than it sounds, but it's better on the other side." She didn't offer forgiveness that night because it wasn't hers to give yet, and she'd learned, finally, that she didn't owe anyone comfort, simply because they were finally ready to hear something true. 2 weeks later, the settlement was finalized. Evelyn resigned quietly from the foundation's board, framed publicly as a transition to focus on family, a face-saving fiction that Gabrielle chose not to correct because correcting it would have served nothing but spectacle. Richard I. filed for divorce 11 days after that, the affair that had funded a stranger's tuition proving in the end to be the wound he couldn't fold quietly into his usual silence. Gabrielle attended none of the fallout. She sent no statements. She gave no interviews, though 2 local business journals had asked. She simply closed the file, submitted her final report, and for the first time in her adult life, walked away from her family's chaos without staying to manage it. soften it, or clean it up afterward. She texted Ji-hoo that evening, the report finally, fully behind her. "It's done. How do you feel?" he asked, the same question he'd asked 6 weeks earlier when this had only just begun. She thought about it for a long time before answering, watching the city lights through her apartment window, feeling something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Not triumph, not vindication, something quieter and more permanent than either. "Free," she wrote finally. "I feel free." "Good," he replied. "You earned that, Gabrielle. Every part of it." She read the message twice, set the phone down, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, slept through the night without a single dream about empty chairs. 8 months later, a small brass sign appeared beside a door on the 14th floor of a converted warehouse building in the Flatiron District. Warren Forensic Advisory. Gabrielle stood in the doorway of her own reception area on opening morning, watching the early light fall across hardwood floors. She'd chosen herself, furniture she'd paid for herself, a business built entirely on the reputation she'd spent a decade earning without anyone's help. She had left Meridian 6 months earlier. Not in anger, not in scandal, simply with the quiet confidence of a woman who had finally understood her own worth well enough to bet on it. 3 of her former clients had followed her within the first month. Word spread the way it does in industries built on trust, quietly, deliberately, one careful referral at a time. She hadn't spoken to her mother since the settlement. She spoke to Chloe occasionally now, careful, tentative conversations that were slowly, awkwardly, becoming something like an honest relationship built for the first time on truth instead of inherited roles. Chloe had moved out of the Tribeca apartment. She was renting something smaller now, something she paid for herself, and there was a new steadiness in her voice that Gabrielle recognized because she'd built that same steadiness once, alone, a long time ago. Richard called every few weeks. Their conversations were quiet, unhurried, full of the kind of honesty that only arrives after everything false has burned away. He had, finally, started saying the things he should have said years earlier. It didn't erase the silence, but it was something. Gabrielle had made peace with the fact that some doors, once closed, simply stayed closed. Her mother had not reached out. Gabrielle no longer waited for her to. She had stopped waiting for anyone's approval a long time ago. That, more than the firm, more than the settlement, more than anything else the past year had handed her, was the thing she was proudest of. The referral came through her firm's general inquiry line on a Thursday afternoon in early June. A request for a comprehensive financial audit ahead of a major acquisition, forwarded from a corporate law firm she'd worked with twice before. Her assistant, Priya, brought the file into her office with a raised eyebrow. "You're going to want to see who signed the engagement letter." Gabrielle opened the folder. Ji-hoo Global Holdings, requesting independent forensic review, target company financials, prior to acquisition. Point of contact, Yoon Ji-hoo, chairman. She hadn't spoken to him in 3 months, not out of any falling out, but the natural quiet that settles between two people who respect each other too much to force something before it's ready. He'd sent a message when her firm launched, simple and warm. "Congratulations. I always knew you'd build something that was entirely yours." She'd thanked him. Life had moved forward from there, each of them occupied, each of them in their own way, waiting for something neither had named yet. She picked up her phone. "I just saw the engagement letter. You could have called instead of going through the formal channel." His reply came within a minute, the same steady rhythm she remembered. "I wanted this to be about the work first. You built something real, Gabrielle. I wasn't going to ask for a favor. I wanted to hire the best forensic accountant in New York. That happens to be you." She smiled at her phone, alone in her office, in the exact same way she had the night he'd sent her those first circled numbers. "Then let's get to work, Mr. Yoon." The audit took 5 weeks. Thorough, exacting, exactly as she conducted every review, with no favoritism extended simply because of who had hired her. She found 2 minor irregularities in the target company's financials, flagged them plainly, and recommended a price adjustment that saved Ji-hoo Global Holdings $11 million in the final negotiation. Ji-hoo read her final report twice before calling her directly, something he rarely did outside their occasional texts. "You just saved my company $11 million, he said. "That's the job. You could have found less, made it easier on yourself, called it clean and moved on." "I don't do easy," Gabrielle said. "You knew that when you hired me." "I did," he said, and she could hear even through the phone something warmer than professional satisfaction in his voice. It's actually the reason I hired you." There was a pause, comfortable, unhurried, the kind of silence they'd perfected together over the past year. "The work is finished," he said finally. "Officially, there's no more reason for us to speak." Gabrielle's chest tightened slightly, an old instinct rising. The reflex to brace for an ending, the way she had braced for endings her entire life. "Is that what you're calling to tell me?" "No," he said. "I'm calling because the work is finished, and I find I don't want that to be the reason we stop talking." She sat back in her chair, looking out over the city through the window of the office she'd built entirely on her own terms, and felt something settle in her chest that had nothing to do with numbers or audits or anything she could put in a report. "Then don't let it be the reason," she said quietly. They met 3 days later. Not at a gala, not at a boardroom, not framed as anything but exactly what it was. A small restaurant near her office, the same one where he'd once asked her opinion on an acquisition report that had really just been an excuse to spend 3 unhurried hours in her company. He was already seated when she arrived, and he stood as she approached the table, the same quiet respect he'd shown her since the moment he'd asked permission to sit across from a stranger with a missing place card. "No engagement letter this time," she said, sliding into the seat across from him. "No," he agreed. "Just dinner." "You're sure that's all this is?" He considered the question seriously, the way he considered everything. Nothing rushed, nothing performed, only the careful honesty she had come to trust more than any promise anyone else had ever made her. "I think," he said slowly, "that I have spent a year admiring your mind, respecting your work, and trusting your judgment more than almost anyone I've ever known. And I think somewhere in that year, without either of us naming it, I started wanting more than your professional opinion at the end of a phone call." Gabrielle held his gaze, steady, unhurried, the same way she'd learned to hold everything that mattered. "I noticed," she said. "I just wasn't sure you had." "I noticed the moment I saw an empty chair with your name missing from it," he said quietly. "I think some part of me has been trying to make sure you never sat alone again ever since." For a long moment, neither of them said anything at all. The restaurant moved gently around them. Quiet conversation, the clink of glassware, a life continuing its ordinary rhythm just beyond their small still table. Gabrielle thought of the empty seat at her sister's engagement party. The missing place card. 31 years of learning to disappear so someone else's story could take up all the light. She thought of every quiet, competent thing she had built since then. A firm with her name on the door. A family finally facing the truth it had avoided for years. A version of herself that no longer needed anyone's permission to exist fully in a room. And she thought of this man across the table, who had never once tried to rescue her, never once tried to fix her, never once tried to be anything other than someone who simply, steadily, refused to look away. "Ask me properly," she said softly. Ji-hoo reached across the table, not for her hand, not yet, but simply resting his palm open on the white tablecloth between them. An offer, not a claim. "Gabrielle Warren," he said, "would you have dinner with me? Not as a client, not as a stranger who noticed an empty chair, just as myself, asking you because I would like very much to keep noticing you for a very long time." She looked at his open hand for a moment. No urgency in it, no expectation, only patience, the same patience he had offered her since the very first night. Then she placed her hand in his. "Yes," she said, "I would like that very much." Outside the restaurant window, the city moved on exactly as it always had, indifferent, unhurried, unaware that somewhere inside a woman who had spent her whole life being overlooked had finally, fully, been seen. Not rescued, not saved, seen. And for Gabrielle Warren, after everything, that had always been the only thing that ever truly mattered. And that's where we'll end today's story. If you enjoyed this journey with Gabrielle and Ji-hoo, let me know by leaving a like and sharing your favorite moment in the comments. I always enjoy reading what stood out to you. If you're new here and love heartfelt billionaire romances, Afro-Korean love stories, and emotional dramas with satisfying endings, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, take care, stay kind, and I'll see you in the next story.